Hello, health champions. Sometimes people keep eating the wrong foods because they just don't know any better. But other times, it's because what they are being told is actually wrong. So today, I want to go over the real reasons you want to avoid these 10 foods. So in no particular order, this is food number 1, canned soup. And here is a brand that shall remain anonymous. And what was interesting was where the source where I got this information, they said to avoid soup. But the only thing out of this list that they found objectable was salt. Now, I think there are a few other things. Salt is about the only thing that I think is relatively safe on this list. But when they talk about something that's enriched, what does that mean? That should be a word that sounds off an alarm bell, because enriched means they took away a lot and put back a little. So it's like I take $1 from you and I give you a penny back, and now I have enriched you. That's what it means. So enriched foods are processed and depleted foods. Next, we have wheat, which we'll go over more later, which is one of the most common allergens. There's virtually no one that tolerates wheat properly anymore. Monosodium glutamate is an excitotoxin. It's a neurotoxin that makes your brain think food tastes better than it does, and it kills brain cells, and it makes you eat more of certain foods than your body normally would. Cornstarch, nothing good about it. Modified cornstarch could mean just about anything. Cane sugar, flavoring could mean anything. Yeast extract is often a pseudonym for monosodium glutamate or other synthetic artificial flavoring agents. Soy protein isolate means that they have processed. They start off with soy, which is not a great food in the first place, but then they process it harshly with solvents and acid to isolate these proteins. So not a great food, harshly processed. And then we have phosphate, and we'll cover this in a couple more places I'll show you. But phosphate is in the body, it works in balance with calcium. In your bone you have 10 parts calcium to 4 parts phosphorus. And anytime that we get too much phosphorus, it's not a bad thing in itself. It's obviously essential, but when we add too much, we unbalance the calcium in the body and we actually deplete calcium from the bone. So processed foods containing a lot of phosphate are actually promoting bone loss and osteoporosis. So canned soup, it's more of an example for you to avoid. Whenever something has this list of ingredients, then you just know it's not a great food. So this carries over to hundreds of different items. Number 2 on the list is white bread. And there is little argument anymore that this is not a great food. First of all, it's hybridized. And that means they've genetically altered it. They've changed it to give higher yields, to be more resistant to weather. And they've also changed it so that it has higher levels of a specific kind of gluten that's extra sticky. That's how they can make this bread so super fluffy, which you can't do with really any other kind of grain. And that makes it chewy and fluffy, but most people have a really hard time tolerating that kind of gluten. That's why some people can eat ancient grains, but they can't eat this modern form of wheat. The wheat grain basically has 3 things in it. It has starch, bran, and germ. And the starch is another form of sugar, bran is the fiber, and germ is where the vitamins and minerals, that's where the fat-soluble vitamins are. But when they process it, in order to turn it into this white fluffy thing, they remove the fiber and they remove all the nutrients. And this is the main reason why the mainstream looks down upon this bread. That's why they don't recommend it, because they say it's empty calories. And also to some degree they say that it has a very high glycemic index of 75 give or take a couple, which is actually higher than table sugar. So it will raise your blood sugar tremendously fast. It's basically just another form of sugar. It will start breaking down into glucose within seconds of being in your mouth, and then it goes very quickly to raise your blood sugar within minutes. Wheat also contains something called wheat agglutinin, which is a lectin. And people can have different degrees of sensitivities to lectins. For some people, it's a life-changing problem, and for some, it's barely noticeable. But what this does is it damages the surface of certain structures, and one is the gut lining. So by damaging the inside of the gut lining, it promotes gut irritation and leaky gut and food sensitivities. By irritating and damaging the inside of blood vessels, called the intima, it promotes cardiovascular disease and inflammation in your cardiovascular and your circulatory system. Another problem with wheat is that most of it is produced with something called glyphosate, which is a probable carcinogen and that has been banned in many countries around the world. But then we have something really, really interesting, that everyone agrees that this is junk food, but for some reason, this closely related thing called wheat bread is promoted as a health food, as a staple, as necessary even. And when we look at the big long list of characteristics, they're virtually identical. The only reason is that in whole grain bread, they keep the bran and the germ, which of course I'm in favor of. You shouldn't remove certain beneficial portions. And the other difference is that the glycemic index is 75 versus 74. So in other words, virtually exactly the same. Everything else about these are identical. In the mainstream, the only thing they object to is that they remove a little bit of the nutrients, which again is a bad thing, but they're missing the big picture that people are reacting, and this is causing inflammation at so many different levels. So I would definitely avoid this, but I would also avoid that as well. Number 3 on the list is canned tuna. And it's not just canned tuna, but any kind of tuna really. It's convenient, it's filling, it's tasty, but it has something called mercury. Tuna is a large fish, it's a predator, so when it eats the smaller creatures of the ocean, it concentrates all the toxins in those smaller creatures. And there was a study, and as a result of that study, they recommended that pregnant women should avoid tuna altogether because mercury is such a potent neurotoxin that it prevents the proper formation of the baby's brain and nervous system. But I think we also want to understand that if it has that effect on the pregnant woman and the fetus, then it's something that we ought to be cautious with. So I'm not saying you need to avoid it 100%, but don't treat it as a staple. Don't eat it all the time. I'd say maybe every couple of weeks or once a month or something, then you have a little tuna. Number 4 is diet soda. And the biggest questions people have all the time is it compatible with keto? Is it all right? Does it spike insulin? Will it break a fast? And the answer is that it works for keto. It doesn't spike insulin, at least not much in most people. It doesn't really break a fast. But those are irrelevant questions because this is not food. Any more than you would eat paint chips with lead in them, you do not want to touch this stuff. Aspartame is one of the more popular artificial sweeteners, and it breaks down into formaldehyde, which is embalming fluid, and ethanol, that's wood alcohol, the stuff that makes you go blind. And the list of complaints about aspartame is endless, but they have a hard time pinning anything specific on it, so it's still out there. The other popular artificial sweetener is called sucralose, also known as Splenda. And when they marketed this and promoted it, they had learned that people didn't like artificial things. So they spent a lot of time and energy promoting sucralose as something natural. They said it's as natural as carbohydrate and sea salt, because sodium chloride is sea salt and carbon is in every living thing. But what they lied about, what they implied that is not true, is that these things go together, and they don't. In sucralose, they force them together into a covalent bond, which is a strong bond. And these two things, when you put them together in that kind of bond, they become pesticides. And that's how they discovered sucralose, is that they were trying to develop a pesticide when they found that it tasted sweet. So things like DDT and aldrin and dieldrin, and the list goes on and on. This is just a partial list. What do these things have in common? They are chlorocarbons, or also known as organochlorides, and they have been proven to be so toxic that they were banned years or decades ago. But they're so pervasive in the environment that even 50, 60 years after the ban, they are still detectable. Number 5 on the list is potato chips. And the most common objection that you hear is that they're high in salt and high in fat. I don't have a problem with that, but we'll talk more. And therefore, of course, they're high in calories. Something curious, though, is that it basically produces a bottomless craving. There's only so much fat you can eat. There's only so much bacon or so much meat or so much steak. But there is no limit to how much potato chips you can eat. It just keeps going and going. If the bag is opened, then it's going to get finished. So that sort of gives you a hint that this acts more like a drug than a food. And it's not the amount of fat that's the problem with chips. It's the type of fat. They fry these things in seed oils, commercial mass-produced oils that are inflammatory. They're highly, harshly processed with chemicals and high heat, and they promote insulin resistance because they're inflammatory and because of something called reactive oxygen species that create oxidative damage. When I first came to the US, I was surprised to find that potato chips was promoted as food. I'd always thought of them as a party snack. It's something that you had once a month or less at a party. But here, it was everywhere. It was every fast food meal had the option of being served with potato chips. So unfortunately, I expect the rest of the world is kind of following suit in that regard, that we're just allowing more and more processed foods to be part of actual, what we consider food, rather than the occasional snack. Number 6 is fake maple syrup. Real maple syrup is a relatively natural product. You basically drill into a tree and you give it some time and you get maple syrup dripping out. Now, that's still very high in sugar, but it does have some nutrients, and if you were to only make a treat when there's a birthday or a special event, then I don't have a huge problem with maple syrup. However, when you start eating it with pancakes for breakfast every day, now that's a problem. Even more of a problem is when we don't differentiate between different types and we think that one thing is just as good as the other, but most of the commercial stuff is not natural. Now you have a processed, refined, empty calorie sugar that is basically all of what this regular pancake syrup is. Or even worse, they use more high fructose corn syrup. Or even worse, they start promoting sugar-free syrups because they figure, hey, the sugar is the problem. Now let's make something sugary that doesn't have sugar. So now it's a complete disaster and chemical concoction. So now we have sorbitol, cellulose, caramel color, and the list goes on and on and on. So again, when you see these kinds of things, just stay away. And let me also point out that again we have phosphate and phosphoric acid, that it's a natural compound. In small amounts it's not a problem, but by the time you start adding it in a lot of processed foods, now it starts pulling calcium out of the bone and promoting osteoporosis. So keep a lookout for that. Number 7 is margarine, and this has an interesting history. It goes back to 1869 when Napoleon had a contest where he invited people to come up with a cheap butter substitute so that he could send it with the army and so that poor people could afford it. And in the beginning, they came up with something that was made from beef tallow, and they mixed it with water and milk, and apparently it was resembling butter, and they were real happy. And that was how margarine was made until the Great Depression and World War II era, because now there was a rationing of animal products. They couldn't get easy access to the tallow anymore, and they had to find something else. So now they started using seed oils and plant oils. The problem was the tallow was solid at room temperature, but seed oils are liquid at room temperature or refrigerated. So they had to really start changing the chemical structure of these, and that's where they invented hydrogenation, which basically means you're pumping a bunch of hydrogen in at high pressure and high temperature, and you saturate that unsaturated oil. But in the process, you create something called trans fat. And trans fats are so harmful, and they are generally recognized as harmful. So now there is a requirement for food labeling. But here's the curious thing, that here we have a food label that says trans fat 0, and yet over here in the fine print they say partially hydrogenated. And we know that partial hydrogenation produces trans fat. So how can this be? Here they say that it's in the product, and here they say 0 grams of trans fat. So this is a labeling trick. It's called lying. That 0 grams per serving means that you could still have 0.499999 grams per serving. Not per cup or per package, but per serving. So depending on how you define the serving, you can still have a tremendous amount of trans fats in here and still comply to the labeling requirement and satisfy people and be able to put on the front and say, look, 0 trans fat. So if you define your serving size as 5 grams, now your product can still have 10% trans fats. And these are toxic at very, very low levels. If you define a serving as 10 grams, now you can have 5%, and as in this case, a tablespoon is 12 grams, you could still have 4.2% trans fat and call it 0 grams of trans fat per serving. So don't fall for these tricks, they are lying. And they'll come up with one clever, deceiving name after another, such as, I can't believe it's not butter. Well, you'd better believe it's not butter. And on a completely unrelated note, if you have a bunch of these cute guys in your yard and you're trying to grow something, then you know that anything you try to grow, they refer to as, I can't believe it's not lettuce. Number 8, energy drinks. People drink these because it feels like they give you energy, but that's a fallacy. They do not give you energy, they borrow energy. So you're borrowing energy from someplace so that you could have it temporarily. But what these drinks actually do is they are stimulants. And stimulants are things like caffeine in coffee. It perks you up so you think that you have more energy, which you do temporarily. But the more often you do that, the more you're going to kind of have to pay it back later. They also contain guarana, which is just another name for caffeine. Guarana is another plant besides the coffee bean that contains caffeine. They also throw in some synthetic B vitamins, which in large doses act as stimulants. And they throw in a bunch of sugar or worse. And the sugar can give you the impression you raise your blood sugar, you get a little spike, and you feel a little perky for a short time. Or worse is they call them sugar-free, and they just jack up the caffeine and they give you some artificial sweeteners. But realize that while these seem to give you some energy, they actually borrow energy. It's like a credit card. The more you use it, the more you have to pay back later. it gives you the impression of having a resource in the short term, but it costs you way more long term. Number 9 is fruit juice. And while fruit juice is made from fruit, which potentially has some benefit, in fruit juice you concentrate the nutrients. So that could theoretically be a benefit, that there's some nutrients, now you concentrate the nutrients, you can get more of them at once. But the problem is you also concentrate the sugar. So while you're getting a little more of something you might want, you're getting a lot more of something you don't want. And then the bigger problem is that everything that you buy in the store is going to be pasteurized by law, and therefore they're going to kill off every form of enzyme, everything that's been alive, and virtually destroy all the nutrients in there. So the store-bought stuff that they call juice is really just sugar water. It is right on par with soft drinks. You could argue it's a tiny little bit better because there's still some nutrients, and yes, that's true, but think of it basically as a soft drink. Number 10 on the list is deli meats or luncheon meats or cold cuts. And ham, sausage, prosciutto, salami, they're very popular. They could be made from pork or beef or chicken or turkey. And what's the greatest objection that is being brought forward? It's that they're high in salt. And this is not why you want to worry about these. Next objection often brought up is that there's an association to cancer. They found that people who eat a lot of these have higher rates in cancer. But we want to understand that it's the difference between the raw material and the end product. We want to start asking, how was it raised? And even more so, much more important, what was added? Because you could have a good raw material, but if you add a bunch of chemicals and junk, now it's poison. So some of these things that are added are sodium nitrite. It's a preservative that enhances and maintains the red color. But there's also a lot of products that are perfectly fine without this. They also add sugar. They add various chemicals, preservatives, BHT, butylated hydroxytoluene, and many other things with equally strange names. They add monosodium glutamate that we talked about. It's an excitotoxin. It makes things taste better, makes your brain think they taste better than they do, and therefore you eat more than you normally would. And they put things like cornstarch in here, and why not put some more artificial color, some aspartame and some sucralose in there as well, because people are hooked on the sweet taste. Fortunately, there are a lot of alternatives today in the deli counter, especially if you find a good quality store that caters to the health-oriented people, that you can get all of these without any of these chemicals or artificial ingredients, and then it is a perfectly fine food. If you enjoyed this video, you'll love that one next. And if you really want to learn more about how the body works and how to master health, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.